hit rate groups suck. I don't like them. In general, I definitely don't like them with NFL statistics and the small sample size problems we have. Let me try and alliterate that. Between 2001 and 2021, so 20 years of history, we've had 6 wide receivers drafted in the first round with a BMI below 25. Quick side note, we used to have to talk about BMIs of 26 point something, and then it's now dropped to 25 because this arbitrary line keeps getting disproven. But in those 20 years, we had 6 wide receivers drafted in the very first round, so max opportunity, max expectation that they're going to do well, and it is the biggest hit rate group. Those 6 wide receivers: Will Fuller, Calvin Ridley, Marcus Brown, Devontae Smith. Those are the ones drafted in the most recent era. Now, Will Fuller did leave the league eventually. I think he's now left due to injuries, but he was on pace to have a top 12 season at least once. And that was with DeAndre Hopkins on the field. And there was a lot of expectation that he would grow into a bigger fantasy asset, and he just ended up not because of injuries mostly. Calvin Ridley is the only 2018 wide receiver with one top 24 season on his resume. That was gambling, and he's meant to be back next year, so we'll see how that shakes out. Marcus Brown has had 2 top 24 seasons in his career, and has been on pace to be top 12 at least twice through each of the first 8 weeks of this season, most recent season 2022, depending on when you're watching, and also in 2021, and it kind of got derailed by injuries to his fellow teammates rather than him. Kyler Murray this year, for example. Now, that doesn't mean he's finished in the top 12 twice, but it is worth noting that the context in this very small group becomes really interesting if you actually look at it. Devontae Smith actually had a top 12 season this year in points per game, but finished just outside of it in overall points scored, and he has at least 2 now, I think, top 24 seasons on his resume. The 2 before that, in the less recent era, before 2008, were Ted Ginn, who played between 2007 and 2020. He played for 13 years. He never started less than 13 games, except in 2 seasons at age 33 and 35. And the reason I mention that is because BMI and physical metrics, in terms of size, often come up in terms of hardiness or sturdiness or ability to take a hit. And if BMI is your argument for that, I don't think we're seeing a lot of excessive injury rates or injury because of on-field play, at least. He also had 4 700-yard seasons, won a Super Bowl with one team, and played for many high-level franchise players. He was not a fantasy darling. He was a deep down the field 9-route type guy, but we kind of knew that with his draft capital, and that's another element to this group. If you want to actually dig through the hit rate groups that people do and don't like based on arbitrary thresholds from the combine, you find a lot of context of they don't fill the prophecy of why the hit rate group matters, i.e. in this case they're meant to not be able to play in the NFL consistently or start games consistently over time. And also, if you look at the ones that disappoint, they often disappoint because, one, we were wrong about how good they were relative to what they did in college to the NFL, or because they kind of hit expectation and had exaggerated draft capital or more NFL players than they were fantasy players, and there were ways to actually see that. Now, the only other guy on this list, the 6 players that were drafted with a BMI below 25 in the first round since 2001, said that real fast, was Ashley Leely. I think that's how you say his name. Apologies to his mother if you say it differently. He played between 2002 and 2008. He played for 8 seasons. He played a full complement of games for those first 4 seasons, and then Denver traded up for another wide receiver in the draft. And so Wikipedia tells me there was a disgruntledness to his attitude after that point, and he ended up kind of playing another few seasons at different teams and not doing much else, certainly in terms of fantasy. Before that, he never played less than 13 games. He had a 1,000-yard season, finished in the top 25 in PPR scoring, although it's worth noting that in the era, standard scoring would have been the standard. 5 seasons with over 550 receiving yards. He was fine, but definitely not a great first-round pick hit. But again, played consistently and seemed to have a reduced value role, especially for that era in the NFL. So let's consider this with different definitions, because that's what I often get drawn into when I have this conversation on Twitter, at least. What do you define as a hit? So this hit rate table shows the hit rates by draft round, and also whether you're just looking at the average player from a draft round and whether you're looking at a player with a BMI below 25. I also divided it between players with 1 season at certain thresholds and players with 2 seasons at a certain threshold. So you see that 50% of wide receivers drafted in the first round have at least 1 top 24 season, 54%, and 38% finish with at least 1 top 12 season between 2001 and 2021. So again, that 20-year history. What you can actually see is that in each individual group, the BMI group does have a slightly lower hit rate, but nowhere near disproportionately exaggerated based on their BMI. And in fact, if you bring it into the common era, the majority of players drafted in the first round actually have BMIs of below 25, they actually seem to hit at a disproportionately high rate, especially when you're just looking at one season. So we switch it over to 2008 to 2021, so you're looking at a different group right now, and you'll notice that the BMI group for 2 seasons hits at an excessive rate. 50% of players drafted in the first round with a BMI below 25, at or below 25, have hit for at least 2 top 24 seasons. 50% have hit for at least 1 top 12 season. It falls down when you go to 2 top 12 seasons, but that's why I ran you through the list to start with. Many of those have extracurricular or extra context to why they didn't have 2 top 24 seasons. Calvin Ridley definitely would have that, I believe, if he hadn't got suspended. I think Marcus Brown has proved he's capable of doing that, and Calvin Ridley and Devontae Smith did this year, at least in points per game. If you're talking about max upside, I think there's no real reason to think BMI has a strong correlation to being in that 19% of wide receivers from the first round who hit for 2 top 12 seasons. I think that has more to do with the fact by the time you get into this date range, there's only 10 players who actually fit that criteria. 10. And increasingly, we have seen more players with lower BMIs drafted into the NFL. Now, you could argue that BMI and physical makeups have a correlation or a tendency to correlate at least, although I think mismatches tend to argue against it, but to certain roles in the NFL, and that has different expectations for their fantasy input, and it's only recently, or since 2008, that this lower BMI player has been capable of finding volume at those particular roles to become extremely fantasy viable. Sure, but we played now, and I really only know about how to chase fantasy points. I'm not trying to play NFL GM here. I don't know how good or bad players are at different physiques for actually playing football. But if you're talking about expectation of fantasy points, I think things actually have correlation and not just kind of small hit rate groups. 75% of all first round players with a BMI below 25 hit for at least 1 top 24 season, 56 for the average of the round. So you could argue that you shouldn't draft any player with a BMI over 25 because there's a higher risk of at least not having at least 1 top 24 season. I don't think that's true. This is an argument I used to point out because it's exactly the same with 40 time, where technically the faster you are, the less likely you are to finish with a fantasy relevant season. I don't think that logic bears out, and I think the reason hit rate groups get used with BMI and 40 time and everything else is because the logic seems to work out if you narrow a strict enough definition of what is a hit and look through the right time frame in a time frame that players really weren't being drafted with those sizes or those speed times. Or to put that another way, 100% of first round players who busted from the first round, never had even a top 36 season, had a BMI over 25. That logic is just as consistent as the idea that players with lower BMIs can't play or won't play or don't have the upside of other players in the NFL, but reversed, and it's got an even better hit rate. 100% of the busts had BMIs over 25. Doesn't make them more risky, it just means that this number that doesn't correlate also makes fairly poor hit rate groups. The reason is fairly simple, and that's it doesn't have causation, because your BMI or their BMI doesn't tell you how good they are at playing. I think it's much fairer to draw the conclusion that sometimes we are wrong at how well a player is going to elevate to the NFL level. And the reason that the hit rate groups sometimes seem to confirm the idea of the combine numbers indicating players who are more or less likely is actually not because of causation, because it doesn't cause their ability to elevate because we got their profile wrong, or the context of how their career played out. I left that table up for a while because I didn't want to run through all the rounds, but you can see there is definitely an exaggerated disproportion when you get to the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th rounds. But then again, you run into the sample size problems of so few wide receivers are getting drafted that have any realistic expectation of being fantasy relevant in those rounds, that mostly it's some of that a little bit of context, if you look at the group, ends up disproving that BMI or physical metrics had any particular relevance to how likely, if you were trying to predict instead of hindsight or Monday morning quarterback, who did and who didn't. And that's essentially what these hit rate groups are for me. When I look into them, they seem to be Monday morning quarterbacking history and while trying to predict the future. And again, the correlation testing does not back up any hit rate group you make out of these kind of numbers. The causation does not seem to be there. I would say the Combine can have a lot of utility in terms of expectations of the draft. If your rookie draft doesn't happen after the draft, after the NFL draft, then it could have a lot of signal, because NFL teams definitely value it. There's a lot of real football that goes on that I don't know about. So yeah, just a quick video to look at why I often dismiss, hopefully in a funny, if not condescending way, combine numbers and what I think of players based on it. It's not interesting. I mean, it's fascinating to see MathBomb and other people on Twitter try to create composite athleticism scores and find a way of comparing players that way. I think it's definitely viable that way. Their work is valued and valuable, and you should go check it out. But in terms of including it in a model, using it as this player has a lower BMI or a higher 40 time, therefore I will draft them, I'd just say that Jalen Reagor had a great BMI and a great 40 time, and Devontae Smith had an okay 40 time, if I remember, had a good 40 time and a below BMI, and you can find constant examples like that, where it just wouldn't have been a good decision maker, even when you break it down to an individual decision for an individual draft class. But anyway, let me know what you think, as long as you agree with me. No, really, I'm happy to talk to you in the comments about it. Thanks very much, and I will see you in the next video.